Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. This week we are covering, as always, the weekend box office, which saw Civil War debut at number one, a divisive movie, but one that drew a lot of people to the movie theater, so we'll look at that, as well as updates on some of the other movies that are currently in theaters. But let's jump to the weekend top five. As I mentioned, Civil War was the number one movie at $25.7 million, the upper part of expectations for the film. We'll see how it does from here, though. As I mentioned, some sharp divisions with the film. It got a B- cinema score, which is not great for a huge blockbuster, but also somewhat common for Alex Garland movies, A24 movies, because it did play with audience expectations, and seeing the responses roll in on the comment section of my review for the film it's been pretty crazy, because there's a lot of people saying that it was an attack on the right wing. There's a lot of people saying that it was a cowardly attack on nobody. There's a smaller number of people saying that it was an attack on the left wing. It seems to have been different things to all sorts of different people. The downside for Civil War being it seems like a lot of people didn't like it for whatever the thing is that they thought that it was. I personally really enjoyed the film. I didn't see it coming from a particular political perspective, but as I kind of predicted in my review, people did seem to sort of project a lot onto the film, and some people reading things into the movie that I certainly didn't see, but it certainly got people talking, and that is, I think, the goal, what Alex Garland was going for. However, long-term at the box office, is that division, is that word of mouth going to drive people away? We'll see what happens. In second place was Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, which dropped around 50% in its third weekend for $15.5 million. It's now at $158 million total domestic. Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire goes up to third place in its fourth week, a 36.1% drop. Its domestic total now just under $100 million. It's at $96.9 million. Kung Fu Panda has another strong hold. It drops just 28.8% in week number 6 for $5.5 million. Its domestic total now approaching $175 million. And Dune Part 2 returns to the top 5 after being exiled last weekend, a 41.7% drop in its 7th week in theaters. Its domestic total now just under $275 million. So let's talk a little bit about Civil War. It set a personal mark for A24. This is also their biggest budgeted film of all time. It was number one overall as far as all A24 opening weekends by almost double the previous record, which was Hereditary back in 2018, my beloved Hereditary. The previous record was $13.5 million. Civil War debuts with $25.7 million. The third highest grossing weekend in A24 history was last summer with Talk to Me at $10.4 million. Then we had 2016's The Witch at $8.8 million and 2021's The Green Knight at $6.7 million. So you can see the Civil War working on a stage far bigger than A24 has ever worked on. When you look at all wide opening weekends domestically for A24, so this includes movies that started in limited release but then moved into wide release. The list is pretty much the same: Civil War, followed by Hereditary and Talk to Me. But the wide release of Uncut Gems back in late January 2019 makes the list at $9.5 million in fourth place, which bumps The Witch down to fifth place. And already Civil War is one of the highest grossing films in A24's history. These are the top 10 domestic grosses, not just opening weekends, but overall grosses for A24 films. And you can see that Civil War in just one weekend has already made more than Alex Garland's debut film, Ex Machina, at $25.4 million. It's at $25.7 million. It's also gaining very quickly on Ari Aster's second film, Midsommar, at $27.4 million. It will outgross Moonlight, which is at $27.8 million. And it'll get past The Iron Claw from this past holiday season at $35.6 million. Then the questions come in because of that cinema score and because of the audience reaction. What will the legs be on this movie? Can it get to a 2x multiplier? If it can get to $50 million, then it will bypass Hereditary, it will bypass Talk to Me, it'll bypass Lady Bird, and it will be challenging Uncut Gems for that number 2 spot, but we'll have to see if it has that ability to leg out, or if it was an extremely front-loaded opening. It will not get anywhere near Everything Everywhere All at Once, I don't think. I don't see this thing getting a 3 times multiplier, so I think that that is pretty secure at number 1. But if Civil War can double its opening at the box office, if that word of mouth doesn't keep too many people away, then this could be a contender for the second highest grossing film in A24 history domestically. Let's also look at Alex Garland's history as a writer and or director, and Civil War was the top opener there as well. $25.7 million easily tops his previous personal best, which was Annihilation back in 2018, for which he was the writer-director at $11 million. Then we have 2003's 28 Days Later, which he wrote the screenplay for, at just over $10 million, though adjusted for inflation, it would probably be contending for that number one spot and would definitely be number two. 2012's Dread, which he also wrote, and according to some people, also had a big hand in directing, is at number 4 with $6.2 million. And then in 5th place, I have the wide debut of Ex Machina back in April of 2015. After a couple weeks in limited release, it opened wide to $5.3 million. And I mean, honestly, looking at those movies, if you were to sit me down and say, hey, you have to watch these 5 movies all in a row, I'd be pretty stoked. I mean, Alex Garland has got a damn good record as a writer-director. Even though some movies like Annihilation aren't people's cup of tea, he shows an ambition and a talent for filmmaking that I don't think that you see with a whole lot of directors, especially the consistency. Let's take a look at some of the numbers for the second place movie, which was Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. It stays as the 3rd highest grossing domestic Legendary Monsterverse film, but it's only about $10 million behind Kong Skull Island to be number 2, which it will obviously get to. And then the question is, can it get to $200 million to best 2014's Godzilla? I think that is a bigger question. We'll see how it plays out in these last few weeks before summer movie season begins in earnest, but it does have a lock on the 2nd highest grossing film in the Legendary Monsterverse. Let's talk a little bit about Ghostbusters Frozen Empire as well. It's at $96.9 million, and it is running out of steam. I think it is very questionable at this point whether it will be able to stay out of the basement as far as Ghostbusters movie grosses. And remember, these are unadjusted for inflation. It will easily be the lowest grossing Ghostbusters movie when you do adjust for inflation, but it's got to get to $112.4 million in order to get over the hump with Ghostbusters 2. It's going to take some doing, but then again, it's starting to show a little bit better holding power at the box office, so we'll track it here in the next couple weeks. I would bet that it's probably not going to get there, but we'll see what happens. Dune Part 2, as I mentioned, returned to the top 5 as it begins the process of wrapping up its theatrical run. I think it's got a few good weeks left in it, but we've got the physical media date, we've got the streaming date, and all of that stuff. And I wanted to look at the profitability for the film and also talk about some of the X factors that we have with this movie that we don't necessarily have with other movies. So this is my standard breakdown. You've seen this on the show before as far as the profitability in the theatrical window. Again, remembering this does not have anything to do with ancillary revenue streams, digital streaming, rentals, etc. Right now, I've got Dune Part 2 at a reported budget of $190 million. I'm going to give it an advertising budget of $150 million, which seems about right for a movie its size. So that's an estimated cost of around $340 million. And looking at the money coming back to the investors, which are Legendary and Warner Brothers, the movie's made $48.2 million in China, which according to the standard cut means $10.8 million is coming back to investors. But that's the first X factor here, because Legendary, the company that owns Dune Part 2 and really made Dune Part 2, Warner Brothers is the studio that's releasing it, is a Chinese company, or partially a Chinese company. So I think that it's likely, perhaps, that more of the Chinese gross than usual is going back to Legendary because that company is based partly in China, but I don't know that for a fact. So I have the standard cut from the Chinese gross going back to Legendary and Warner Brothers, but that may not necessarily be the case. If I find information that says otherwise, I'll try to include it here on the chart. Again, looking at the standard calculations internationally, I've got 40% of Dune's $364.2 million international gross going back to investors, so that's another $145.6 million. And then $66.6 million from the first week of domestic release, that's a 60% share. $35.8 million of week number 2, which is a 55% share, and then $45.7 million of the release from week 3 on, that's a 50-50 cut. When you put all that together, it has a worldwide gross right now of $684.5 million. I estimate a net of $304.7 million, put up against costs of $340 million. I currently have Dune Part 2 running a theatrical shortfall around $35.2 million, again, according to standard calculations. By the time its run is done, then it will probably be very close to breaking even, in the theatrical window if it doesn't eke out a slight profit theatrically. And when you add in the streaming and everything else, Dune Part 2 is going to be a profitable movie for Legendary and Warner Brothers. It's not going to be a huge profit generator in the sense of a movie like Barbie, but I don't know if the expectations were ever that Dune was going to get to the level of Barbie. And honestly, it is, I think, a net positive for the studio if you have a film that is able to break even or come close to breaking even theatrically, turn a profit for you with ancillary revenue streams. And this is a prestige sort of project. There will probably be multiple Oscar nominations that stem from Dune Part 2, or there damn well should be. There certainly weren't enough on the first one, particularly in the Best Director race. It's the kind of movie that I think studios want to be involved with. It generates goodwill. The fans like it, the press likes it, the critics, the media, everything else. And honestly, if you can take this saga and come close to breaking even theatrically, I think is an achievement, because you're selling some pretty hard material to an audience and getting a very large number of people out to see it. I think that's an accomplishment. So Dune, not a massive profit center, but I think an advantageous one for the studios involved, which I think is why we will probably see a third Dune movie. At least I hope we will. And having now finished Dune Messiah, I am very curious to see what that third movie looks like. Let's take a look at numbers 6 through 10 from this past weekend. At number 6 was Monkey Man, which saw a pretty steep decline, a 59.6% drop in its second weekend. It falls out of the top 5. A take just over $4 million for a domestic total of $17.7 million. And then we have The First Omen, also in its second week. It drops 54.5%, which is a decent hold for a horror film. A $3.8 million total for a domestic total of $14.6 million. And really, with those two posters now directly side by side, they do look so similar. And I actually did a little bit of research. They were indeed created by the same graphic design firm. So the same company designed both posters. And really, I think it is unfortunate that these two movies came out so close together. When you're designing these posters, you don't know that they're going to come out the same week. And I think that it does kind of pigeonhole your work, and you can't really see some of the creativity that is on display from this company in posters for movies like Scream 6, 2022's Hellraiser, Black Widow, The Call, Acrimony, Blair Witch, Daybreakers, or 30 Days of Night. You know how people say it looks like all movie posters in Hollywood are designed by the same people? Yeah, it turns out mostly they are. Studios just hire the same firm to make the same poster for the same movies over and over and over again. That's just how the business works. Rounding out the top 10, we had a 20th anniversary re-release of Shrek 2. That's right, people younger than me. It's happening to movies from your childhood now. $1.4 million for the weekend and a number 8 placement. In 9th place is the movie The Long Game at $1.3 million. And then at number 10, a special event, Suga, August D-Tour D-Day the movie, which played only one night this past weekend, made just under $1 million. Its gross combined with an earlier showing of the same film during the week is at about $2.2 million. Looking at movies that dropped out of the top 10, Arthur the King is out after 4 weeks and Immaculate is out after 3 weeks, which means we get one last chance to see Sydney Sweeney and Mark Wahlberg look into each other's eyes. Also dropping out after 1 week apiece are Someone Like You and Wicked Little Letters. And while we're talking about Immaculate dropping out of the top 10, I also wanted to talk about the highest grossing releases from Neon, another independent distribution label like A24. Immaculate is now the 4th highest grossing film in Neon's history at $15.2 million. It's about $3 million behind Ferrari. I don't know if it's going to get there. So it looks like it's going to end at number 4, just ahead of Three Identical Strangers. But again, we're seeing these smaller independent distribution labels taking bigger and bigger swings. Looking at movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, well, Immaculate lost 1,100 of its theaters and is now out of wide release. It's now in only 600 theaters, so that's probably a good reason why it dropped out of the top 10. Someone Like You lost almost half of its theaters in weekend number 2 and is also out of wide release. It lost 881. It's now in 921 theaters. In the Land of Saints and Sinners lost the bulk of its theaters, 604 of them. It's now in 145 theaters. Late Night with the Devil, which I reviewed here on the channel last week, lost a little under half of its theaters. It lost 552. It's now playing in 607. And Imaginary lost over half of its theaters, 519 of them. It's now in 405 theaters. Markdown is closing this week is Migration after a 16-week run. its final gross, or at least the gross close to final, sometimes some money trickles in after I officially label a movie closed, is at $127.3 million. And even though it had impressive legs, some of the best legs of 2023, it's still almost the lowest grossing film in Illumination's history. It's at number 13 out of 14. It comes in about $30 million behind The Secret Life of Pets 2 and about $20 million ahead of 2011's Hop. It's also in the same position worldwide. It came in just under the $300 million mark at $295.5 million, ahead of the Hop and underneath the Lorax. And it's kind of a good news, bad news thing for Illumination. This was a movie with a reported $72 million budget, so given its worldwide gross, it probably did pretty well for itself, but it certainly didn't do a whole lot for the brand or show a whole lot of brand expansion. It really does seem like the Illumination brand is tied closely to Minions and, of course, the Super Mario Brothers movie, which was a big hit last year. Of course, the good news for Illumination is that they have more Minions coming out this summer with Despicable Me 4. Looking at what I like to call our road to recovery, the blue line is the weekend average for the years 2015 through 2019. The red line would be the average for the years 2021 to 2023, and the dotted black line would be our weekend box office for this year. And as you can see, for the second straight weekend, we are below even our average since theaters reopened in 2021, and of course well below the average for the pre-pandemic era. The highest performing film for the years 2015 to 2019 was The Fate of the Furious, which opened on this weekend, and the highest performing film for 2021 to 2023 was last year's Super Mario Brothers movie, which had a second weekend of just over $90 million. We performed well below that average, and we are getting into very soon the summer movie season, so we'll see how that compares both with the pre and post-pandemic numbers. We've got a lot more charts to go over, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsor for this week's episode. This episode is brought to you by Miracle Made. People put all kinds of thought into how and when they sleep, finding that perfect balance of too tired or not tired enough. But do you know what one of the biggest impacts on sleep quality is? Your own temperature. And if you find yourself waking up with the night sweats or shivering under the covers, I recommend checking out Miracle Made sheets. Miracle Made sheets are designed to keep your body temperature at the right spot for you. Their silver-infused fabric was inspired by NASA to regulate your temperature, and they're also incredibly comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands. And as a bonus, Miracle Made sheets are also made to prevent up to 99.7% of bacteria growth, which means they smell better and you can keep them on longer. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code Dan at checkout, you'll also get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle's so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/Dan and use the code Dan to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/Dan to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Let's take a look now outside of our domestic box office and look at the top 5 films internationally. So this is all countries that are not the US and Canada. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is at number 1 at $33.7 million, followed by Kung Fu Panda 4 at $25.8 million. Detective Conan: The $1 Million Pentagram is in third place. This was a huge weekend in Japan for that movie. I think I read it was the second best opening in Japanese history. $21.7 million. It's the 27th feature film about the teen detective. The Boy and the Heron continues an immensely successful run in China. It's going to make over $100 million from the Chinese market alone. It's going to be the top market for the movie in the world. $12.4 million. Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire is also still rolling out in some markets worldwide. It is at number 5 with $10.8 million. And I mentioned The Boy and the Heron's success in China. According to some reporting, it hasn't yet updated on a lot of the box office tracking sites that I follow, but I found this in a couple of different media reports. The Boy and the Heron's worldwide gross due to its huge run in China is now at around $294.8 million. That would make it Studio Ghibli's second highest grossing film of all time worldwide, though I don't think it's going to get close to Spirited Away's $383.8 million. But this has been a really impressive sort of second act for The Boy and the Heron. It had the Japanese opening. It did well. It did well here in the US. It's sort of a surprise winner for the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature. And now it has a huge box office run in China. This movie has had very long legs as far as creative and artistic achievements, and it's still going. We're still making news with The Boy and the Heron. When you combine the international and the domestic numbers, we get our top 5 films worldwide. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire drops 45.6% from last weekend for a worldwide weekend of $49.2 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 drops 10.8% for a worldwide take of $31.4 million in second place. Civil War, driven mostly by its domestic debut, is in third at $29.9 million. Then we have Detective Conan: The $1 Million Pentagram at $21.7 million in fourth place. And Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire actually picks up about 3% of business at $16.5 million, rounding out the top 5. Looking at the legendary MonsterVerse grosses worldwide, Godzilla Kong: The New Empire has now bypassed Godzilla King of the Monsters to become the 4th highest grossing MonsterVerse film around the world. King of the Monsters made $387.3 million. Godzilla Kong: The New Empire is now at $437.9 million and gaining ground very quickly on Godzilla vs. Kong to become the 3rd highest grossing MonsterVerse movie of all time. We'll now see if Godzilla Kong: The New Empire can speedrun towards that $500 million mark and make a run at Godzilla and Kong Skull Island. Let's return to the domestic marketplace to look at the per theater averages around the country for this past weekend. At number 1 was Sasquatch Sunset, which played in 9 theaters and brought in about $10,000 per theater. That's a pretty good per theater average, obviously the best of the weekend. I honestly would have expected it to be a bit higher just because of the prestige. You've got Jesse Eisenberg and Riley Keough involved with the movie. It's got a sort of buzzy concept. It's a look at Sasquatches in the wild, but the word of mouth has been mixed, I think, or at least from what I've read, has been mixed on the movie. And this may be something that's a little too weird even for the indie crowd. We'll find out a lot more this upcoming weekend because Sasquatch Sunset is having a big expansion into a lot of markets around the country, including mine. Civil War had the 2nd best per theater average for the weekend at $6,699 per theater in 3,838 theaters. Then we had Escape from Germany in 3rd place, bringing in $4,143 in 40 theaters. Escape from Germany is a movie about LDS missionaries getting out of Hitler's Germany during World War II, and it's largely being targeted to the Mormon market. In 4th place is Le Samurai, the 4K re-release, which plays in 2 theaters and brought in $4,042 per theater. And then we have Godzilla Kong: The New Empire bringing in $4,039 per theater in each of its 3,847 theaters. Looking at films that were in limited release, so this is 1,000 theaters or fewer. Suga, August Detour, D-Day the Movie. These are often long titles for these concert films. Played in 787 theaters and brought in just under $1 million total across those theaters. In 2nd place is Sting, which brought in $825,797 in 975 theaters. And honestly, I'd anticipated that Sting was going to make a run for the top 10 because it was in almost 1,000 theaters and because I thought maybe the horror fans would show out more for the movie, but it didn't quite happen that way. However, I had already planned and done the research for a graphic that would have come earlier in the show had Sting made the top 10, but is a little bit later. So if you're one of those people that stays tuned for these deeper charts, consider this to be kind of an Easter egg. I could have gone a lot of different ways, giant spider movies, horror debuts for 2024, but I went with something a little more, I don't know, esoteric, I guess. These are the top 5 openings for movies that share a name with a WWE or WWF wrestler, and yes, to the best of my ability, I did my research on all retired or current wrestling personnel. At number 1 is Avatar, which opened back in December of 2009 to $77 million. You might have heard of Avatar. Avatar was also the wrestling name of Al Snow, who had a short stint in the WWF in the mid-90s. In 2nd place is 2014's Hercules at $29.8 million. Now, Hercules also stars a former/current wrestler, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, but the name Hercules actually belonged to Raymond Constantine Fernandez, who wrestled with the WWF from 1985 to 1992, perhaps most memorable for his loss to Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 2. In 3rd place is The Rock, which doesn't star Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, which opened at $25 million back in June of 1996. In fourth place is The Patriot, which opened in June of 2000 to $22.4 million. The Patriot was the wrestling name of Del Wilkes Jr., perhaps best known for his 1997 feud with Bret the Hitman Hart. And then in fifth place is another Hercules film, 1997's Hercules from Disney, which had a wide opening weekend of $21.4 million. Now, some people say, wait, where was Hulk for Hulk Hogan, or where was King Kong for King Kong Bundy? I actually had some very serious rules for this chart. You had to have the wrestling name be standalone. So Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson wrestles under the name The Rock, whereas Hulk Hogan never really wrestled under the name Hulk. He was always Hulk Hogan, and there's not a movie called Hulk Hogan that made this list. Same with wrestlers named King Kong Bundy. He wasn't King Kong Bundy. He was King Kong Bundy. He never wrestled under the name of just King Kong. Listen, I know these charts are very dumb, but you have to bring rules. You have to bring logic to stupidity like this. So no, Hulk is not on here and King Kong is not on here, because I actually did have to look at the actual delineation of these wrestling names to make this chart that almost nobody, I'm sure, cares about. Let's take a look at our annual box office charts, and we'll start with the 2024 annual domestic box office. Dune Part 2 remains the number one movie of the year quite easily at $272.1 million, followed by Kung Fu Panda 4 and Godzilla Kong: The New Empire. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire moves up to number 4 at $96.9 million. That bumps Bob Marley: One Love down to number 5. The 6 through 10 movies remain the same at Mean Girls, The Beekeeper, Argylle, Madam Web, and Night Swim. Looking at the top 10 films worldwide for 2024, Dune Part 2, again number 1 at $684.5 million. YOLO's in second place at $480.6 million, followed by Pegasus 2 at $469.5 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 is making a move for that number 2 spot. It's at $452.9 million, followed by Godzilla Kong: The New Empire, also making a move to number 2 at $437.9 million. Article 20 is at number 6, and Boonie Bear's Time Twist is at number 7. Those are both Chinese films. Bob Marley: One Love is in 8th place, and Ghostbusters Frozen Empire moves up to number 9, bumping The Beekeeper down to number 10. The 365-day worldwide chart didn't have any changes this week, so I'm not going to cover it, and I'm doing that a little bit more on the show. If a chart doesn't have a major change to it, we'll just skip coverage for that week until I have new news to report. Before we go, as always, I like to take a look at a weekend box office history, and this week we are going back to the year 1997 to the release of a true cinematic classic. I'm talking, of course, about Anaconda, April 11th through the 13th, 1997, the 15th week of the year. Anaconda debuted at number 1 to $16.6 million. What a cast, what a concept, what a terrible / great movie. It ended up at $65.8 million domestically. In second place was Liar Liar. In its fourth week of release, it dropped just 20.7%, $14.4 million gross. Its final domestic gross was at $181.4 million. Jim Carrey obviously had a great 1994. He was in Batman Forever in 1995 and continued his success into the late 90s and, of course, into the 2000s. But I think that I could make the argument that Liar Liar was peak Jim Carrey, because the whole marketing for that movie was literally just the title Liar Liar and a promise of like, Jim Carrey's funny. That was it. That's all you needed to sell people to go see that movie. So while Jim Carrey certainly had years where he had more hits and he had bigger hits, I think Liar Liar may have been the peak. Not to say that I don't enjoy Jim Carrey's work. I very much do, and I love a lot of the stuff that he did after Liar Liar as well. In third place was the Batman to Jim Carrey's Riddler, The Saint, starring Val Kilmer, at $10.1 million in its second week of release. It topped out at around $61.3 million domestically. In fourth place is a movie I've never seen, but I've heard is really good, Gross Point Blank. It opened to $6.8 million. Its domestic gross ended up at around $28 million. And then The Devil's Own, starring Harrison Ford and Brad Pitt, rounds out the top 5. It made $4.1 million in week 3 on its way to a final domestic gross of $42.8 million. Of course, we don't like to just freeze those numbers in time. We like to see what they look like in today's dollars by hitting the inflation button. And when we do, we see that Anaconda debuted to an adjusted total of $32.3 million on its way to a $128.2 million adjusted gross. Liar Liar at $28.1 million in week number 4 and an adjusted gross of $353 million. So that was a huge hit film. The Saint at $19.6 million in its second week week for a final adjusted gross of $119.4 million. Gross Point Blank premiered to an adjusted total of $13.3 million on its way to a final adjusted total of $54.6 million. And The Devil's Own is there with $8.1 million and an $83.4 million final gross. And that does it for Charts with Dan this week. Coming up this weekend, we have a few new releases. First, we have Abigail, the young vampire movie from the directing duo known as Radio Silence, following their success in the horror genre with the two newest Scream films, as well as Ready or Not. We also have The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the latest movie from Guy Ritchie, starring Henry Cavill. Guy Ritchie has just been cranking movies out. He had 2 last year. He's got this one. He's got another one scheduled for early 2025. He also did the Netflix show The Gentleman. The guy just doesn't stop working right now. We also have Spy Family Code White, which is the first movie spinoff from the Spy Family anime series, which is based on the manga. The movie was released in Japan last year and is being released through Crunchyroll here domestically. And then Sasquatch Sunset, which I mentioned had that limited release opening this last weekend, is also expanding this weekend into many, many more markets. And that does it for us here on Charts with Dan. Thank you so much for spending part of your day here with me. Stay tuned right here on the channel. I've got more movie news, reviews, box office, all that kind of stuff. If you like what you see, be sure to tell your friends, share the video, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit the bell. Do all those things people tell you to do because we tell you to do them for a reason. And as always, I appreciate your time. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.